Hello, this is the ACC 242 Exam 1 review on chapters 15 and 16. Chapter 15 was our introduction to managerial accounting. We started out by categorizing our costs. In a big picture environment, we have two basic categories of costs. We have the costs that are direct costs, and the costs that are indirect, the indirect costs. The difference between the two is that the direct costs can be traced, right? So by direct, we can directly trace them to the cost object or the product or the department or whatever it is, the job, for example. So direct costs can be traced. The indirect costs cannot be traced. So that's kind of the distinction between the two. And then the next level of classification that we have for costs is manufacturing costs versus non-manufacturing costs. And we also call those manufacturing costs product costs. And the non-manufacturing costs are called period costs. So the manufacturing costs or the product costs, there are three of them: the direct materials, the direct labor, and the factory overhead. So when we have costs that are related to manufacturing or related to production, well, they have to fall into one of those three categories, either direct materials, direct labor, or factory overhead. So the direct materials are those costs that are key, that are integral to manufacturing or producing the product. They relate to materials. They don't relate to labor or depreciation. They relate specifically to materials that are traceable to the cost object. And the direct labor, I like to think of as the touch labor. That is the labor that is physically involved in touching the product. And then next we have factory overhead. So if we have a manufacturing cost or a product cost that's not direct materials and not direct labor, then by default it is factory overhead. And then the non-manufacturing costs, those are costs that are not related to manufacturing. There are two of them: the selling expenses and the administrative expenses. And the examples that you probably want to work through, at a minimum, the examples that you want to work through would be exercises 15.2, 15.4, and then the chapter 15 application assignment that you had to submit. And then there's also a chapter 15 in class number 1. And these I've included at the bottom. I'll cover those in just a few minutes. So you also, in chapter 15, need to be able to calculate the cost of the materials used. And very simply, that is the beginning materials inventory plus the purchases, right? That gives you what's available. Subtract the ending materials inventory, and you've got the cost of materials used. You also need to be able to calculate the cost of goods manufactured. That's the work in process at the beginning of the period, plus the direct materials, plus the direct labor, plus the overhead. That gives you total manufacturing costs. Subtract the working process at the end of the period, and you've got the cost of goods manufactured. And then the last thing that you need to be able to calculate in this chapter is the cost of goods sold. It's the finished goods at the beginning of the period, plus the cost of goods manufactured. It gives you the cost of finished goods available for sale. Subtract the ending finished goods, and you've got the cost of goods sold. So you need to be able to calculate those three key measures: cost of materials used, cost of goods manufactured, and cost of goods sold. And again, at a minimum, you want to be able to work through that chapter 15 application assignment. And then there's chapter 15 in class number 2 that I've included as well. So the examples, let's just talk through a few examples that you want to be able to think through, work through, and make sure you understand. So in exercise 15.2, you have to classify these costs as either materials, labor, or factory overhead. So remember, when we have manufacturing costs, they have to fall into one of these three categories. They're either the direct materials that we can trace and we choose to trace, or the direct labor, that touch labor that we can trace and we choose to trace. And then the factory overhead is everything else that's related to manufacturing, but not materials and labor. So in this case, depreciation on the assembly line, depreciation is not materials, it's not labor, it is overhead. So the depreciation is overhead, and I've got the solutions to these down here at the bottom, so you can work through them on your own as well. The packaging materials, so those are the materials that are traceable to the product. That's going to be direct materials. The maintenance supplies, well, maintenance is not direct materials. It's not direct labor. It's that other stuff, that miscellaneous stuff. That's overhead. And then D, the licensing payments for use of Disney characters on the children's products. You can't trace that. You can't trace that to your product. That's just going to be overhead. And then the paper used in bath tissue. Well, this is Procter and Gamble, PG. They make consumer products. So we've got bath tissue, right? That's the product. Bath tissue is the product. And that paper that's used in that bath tissue, well, that's going to be direct materials. And then the salary for process engineers. Well, process engineers, that's not direct labor because they're not touch labor. They just provide engineering support for the process, that manufacturing process. That's just overhead. Chemicals for body wash products. So you've got these products, right? And it's a body wash, and you've got to have certain compounds, chemical compounds in the product. That's going to be traceable. That's direct materials. Plant manager salary. Well, you can't trace the manager's salary. That's not touch labor. That's going to be overhead. The scents and fragrances used in making soaps and detergents. Well, that's going to be a direct material, right? Soaps and detergents, kiss, that's a key ingredient to those. It's going to be direct materials. And then wages of production line employees. Those are the people that are physically working on the product. That's touch labor. That's direct labor. So that's how you want to think about it. You want to go through and you want to think about whether or not it's direct materials that you can trace and you choose trace that are significant. Direct labor, touch labor, right? Physically touching the product. And then everything else would be manufacturing overhead or factory overhead. And again, you can work through these and the solutions are listed down here. And then exercise 15.4 is another good one that you want to work through. Here's where you want to be able to classify costs as either being product costs or period costs. Product costs are related to production. Period costs are not related to production. So you've got an apparel manufacturer. They make clothing. And we need to be able to classify these costs. So the chief financial officer's salary, chief financial officer. Financial officer has nothing to do with production. That's a period cost. Sales commissions, that has nothing to do with production. That's a period cost. Property taxes on the factory building, that is a product cost. It's just overhead. You can't trace property taxes to your product. It would just be overhead, but it's a product cost. Depreciation on sewing machines. Well, the sewing machines are used to make the product. That's a product cost. Fabric used during production. That's a product cost. Utility costs for the office building. It's an office building. That's not a product cost, not related to production. That is a period cost. The factory supervisor salaries. Factory, that's a product cost. Depreciation on office equipment, that's not related to production. It's a period cost. The oil that's used to lubricate the sewing machines. Sewing machines are used to make the product. That's a product cost. Advertising expenses has nothing to do with production. That's a period cost. Research and development costs. Research and development, that's not a product cost. Research and development is not directly related to production. That's outside of production. That's a period cost. Repairs and maintenance costs for the sewing machines. Sewing machines are used for production. That's a product cost. M, salaries of the production quality control supervisors. Well, they work in production, product costs. Salaries of the distribution center personnel. Now, here's one that tends to pose problems for students. Salaries of the distribution center personnel. It's not production center personnel, the distribution center. So distribution occurs after production. It's not a cost that's incurred during production, hence it's not a product cost. Product costs are only incurred during production. Once the production is complete, you can't have any more product costs. So if you have product that you've completed and you've sent it to your distribution center, it's a period cost. All distribution costs are period costs. They're not related to production. Those costs are incurred after the production is completed. The travel costs of media relations employees, well, those aren't production related costs. Those are period costs. Wages of the sewing machine operators, well, the sewing machines are used during production. Those are product costs. And I'm sorry, I skipped P, the factory janitorial supplies, factory product costs. Okay. And again, you could work through these, and I've got the solutions listed down here. And then also, there's another one that if you're looking for more practice, in this case, you've got to classify costs again as either being period costs, materials, labor, or overhead. You've got a magazine publisher, so they make magazines, right? They sell these magazines. That's their product. And you've got staples that are used to bind the magazines. Definitely a product cost, but you wouldn't want to trace the cost of staples. That's an insignificant cost. It's just going to be overhead. And then the wages of the printing machine employees, that's touch labor, direct labor. The depreciation on corporate headquarters, that's a period cost, not related to production. The paper used in the magazines, that's the main ingredient, right? The significant material, direct materials. I'm sorry, did I skip the depreciation on corporate headquarters? Corporate headquarters, that would be the period costs. And the sales salary, sales is not related to production. That's a period cost. And then maintenance on the printing machines, that's related to production. It's overhead. It's a product cost. And then also here in class problem number 2, you can practice calculating the cost of materials used, right? It's the beginning balance in the materials plus the materials that are purchased gives you what's available, subtract the ending inventory, and you've got the cost of the materials that were used during the month of April. So you've got some pretty good examples to work through for chapter 15. And you want to go back and again make sure you look at that application assignment because you've got more examples there. I didn't reproduce that here, but you certainly have access to that chapter 15 application assignment, and you want to work through the ones that I've given you here as well. Next, chapter 16, job costing. So the key takeaways from chapter 16, you need to be able to determine the factory overhead rate. And the rate is based on the estimated factory overhead over the estimated activity base. Whatever that base is, direct labor hours, machine hours, whatever we define that base as, that's what you're going to divide by. And when we apply overhead, it's always going to be the rate times that actual activity, whatever the actual activity is, actual machine hours, actual labor hours, whatever it is. And the way we determine the total cost of each job, it's the materials plus the labor plus the overhead that we've applied. And we also need to be able to determine whether we're under or over applied. Compare the actual to the applied. And when the applied is greater than the actual, we're over applied. When the applied is less than the actual, we are under applied. You got some pretty good examples to work through. Exercise 16.9, chapter 16, I've included some additional exercises for you, number 1 and number 3. You want to be able to work through those. So I've included here for you the one that we did in our last class, the job costing problem for these 3 jobs. So you have to, in this case, first find the rate, apply the overhead, determine the cost of each job, and then whether or not the overhead is over or under applied. So the rate, estimated overhead over the estimated hours, $90 an hour. Apply the overhead. It's the rate times the actual hours, right? The rate times the actual hours. So it's $90 an hour, and you want to multiply times the hours you can trace to each job, 120, 190. There's the assigned overhead. And the cost of each job, it's the materials, right? Plus the labor, plus the applied overhead. Materials and labor are given, right? So all the materials and labor are given. You apply the overhead, add all those pieces together, materials plus labor plus overhead. That's the total cost of the job. And are we over or under applied? Compare the actual overhead to the applied overhead. This is all the overhead that we applied. Compare the actual to the applied, and we are under applied because the applied is less than the actual. So that's a good exercise to work through. And then I've also included here for you in class problem number 3, we've got 2 jobs, job number 101 and 102. And in part A, what you had to do was use direct labor hours as the activity base. So find the rate, apply the overhead, and then the total cost for the job. So in part A, direct labor hours is the allocation base, $6 per hour. And then we apply that overhead, right? The rate times the actual direct labor hours, $6 an hour times the hours we can trace to each job. And then the total job cost is the materials plus the labor plus the overhead. And we do that for each job. And part B is just, we changed the allocation base to machine hours. So we got $8 per machine hour, but we did the same thing. The steps are the same. Apply the overhead, and then add the materials, labor, and overhead to get the total cost of the job. So that is A pretty good example of some of the things that you need to be able to work through in chapters 15 and 16 for exam 1. The exam has 4 problems and it is worth 100 points. Make sure you bring a calculator. You can't use your telephone. The calculator app on your phone you will not have access to. You need to have a calculator to use during the exam. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Take care. Good luck on the exam.